And welcome back to News Channel. Culture Shock time on this Thursday, focusing today on Islamophobia in Canada. How deep does it actually go? How much hatred is there out there? Perhaps sometimes in our country we think that this sort of thing doesn't happen. The shooting, though, that happened at that Quebec City Mosque definitely raising concerns about a possible rise of intolerance, hatred, and yes, Islamophobia, not only in Quebec, but right across our country. Of course, in recent years, a lot of talk about the threat of Islamic terrorism, but what about right-wing extremism, white nationalism in Canada? For more, we've put together our Culture Shock panel in Ottawa. We've got Amira El-Gawebi. She is with the National Council of Canadian Muslims in Toronto. We're joined by Safwan Chowdhury, the national spokesperson for the Ahmadiyya Muslim Jamaat. And in Calgary, we've got Dr. Shirley Steinberg, author of Teaching Against Islamophobia. She has covered this issue for a long time in her studies. Amira, if I could start with you, your take. We have this notion Canada's multicultural, open, tolerant, welcoming. There are those, of course, who do not agree with that whatsoever.
Absolutely. So Canada is all those things you've just described, Todd. But unfortunately, as we've seen so tragically on Sunday night, there is a strain of hatred amongst us. And we have been talking about this for many years. We've noted sort of a rise in hate crimes targeting Muslims in this country. It's doubled over the past 3 years, the most significant increase against any religious group in this country. So definitely something is going on. That's for sure. And not only is it manifesting in a tragic death of 6 individuals who are just at a place of worship to sort of gather and connect with their Creator, but it manifests on a daily basis in people's lives. So absolutely, there is definitely a crisis here. And I think this is the moment that Canadians need to come together and confront it.
Shirley, you have been studying Islamophobia in our country for a long time. Give me a little bit of frank talk as far as you're concerned. Are we too complacent in Canada?
Well, I think there's a difference between which Canada we're talking about. And we have to realize that we're in a country of large cities, but lots of rural people. So I think that there's a direct correlation between the amount of people that live in isolated areas which do not have diverse populations. That said, given the situation that has happened last week, I would say there's also a very important conversation about the fact that Quebec has outwardly nurtured Islamophobia for at least 10 years. And it's very clear in a province that has different laws about hate, that allows its cities to actually legislate whether a mosque can even be built in the city limits, and has had hearings to ban women who are visible Muslims. I think there's a conversation also about the difference between Quebec and the rest of Canada.
We want to show the book, Shirley, that you have written here, because I know you focused on this, Teaching Against Islamophobia. Safwan, if I can bring you into the conversation as well, and your read on this, because Canadians are wondering how this could happen, why it would happen. We sometimes look south of the border and we think this kind of thing, this extremism, this is an American problem. It's certainly not a Canadian problem.
And for the most part, I would agree with you. We don't typically see these types of attacks in Canada, but as mentioned earlier, it is on the rise. Obviously, just last year, we saw there was a Muslim lady attacked here in Toronto. We saw people vandalize mosques and break windows. But again, it's important to highlight, for instance, ourselves as the Ahmadiyya Muslim Jamaat, we have a community spread out from Newfoundland to British Columbia, including in Quebec, both in Quebec City and Montreal. And we recognize that our work is cut out for us. We need to really get out there. We need to meet Canadians. We've done various initiatives to provide a counter-narrative, both to radicalization, but also to provide and present the true teachings of Islam. We want everyday Canadians to, at the very least, meet a Muslim and have an opportunity to have a dialogue and to understand all the similarities we have and where we may have some differences, to also to come together. And that is truly what being a Canadian is. This is why most Muslims, I would say, do feel safe in this country and have really embraced Canada as a country of their own.
One of the things that several of the imams said at this public memorial just held in Montreal was it's about fighting ignorance, it's about fighting hatred, and there is, in some cases, just no connection between certain people. They don't understand different cultures and languages and religions, which could be fundamentally at the heart of a lot of this. Amira, I want to give you a scenario, though. What do you think the conversation would be right now had this been a church and had a Muslim man walked into a church and killed 6 people?
I don't even want to go there, to be honest, Todd, because I think it's enough what we're enduring. I think that any time there is an attack on any human being, really, and someone loses their life senselessly, I think all of us kind of come together, you know, in humanity, right? And sort of condemn that kind of violence and just, you know, just our hearts are broken. But I think what you're trying to say, perhaps then, is definitely the you know, Canadian Muslims have certainly faced a lot of scrutiny when it comes to national security issues. That we do know that when it comes to these conversations, and you talked about it a little bit in your intro, we often talk about, you know, Canadian Muslims and this whole conversation about violent extremism, and that, you know, now experts are saying there's so much attention paid to violent extremism, you know, sort of emerging from, you know, the small segment in the Muslim community, but we're not talking about right-wing extremism. We're not having those conversations when, in fact, according to, you know, security agencies, right-wing extremism is growing in this country, and it is actually a high priority. Just at the last Senate hearings of last summer, a Montreal police officer testified that he was most concerned with right-wing extremism in the province of Quebec. That did not make it to the front pages of any major newspaper. So the question becomes, why not? And certainly at this time, we must definitely pay more attention to what's happening on what we would consider the fringe. But as we've seen, it only takes one individual who is listening to the political rhetoric, who's listening to those radio shows that are just pandering in fear and myth and stereotype about a group of people. It takes one person to destroy 6 lives and to leave wives without their husbands and children without their fathers.
What about that, Shirley? Right-wing extremism, white nationalism, white supremacism in Canada?
I think it's very strong. I think there's pockets in the prairies, definitely in British Columbia, and absolutely in Quebec. And we're going to have this conversation, but how long will this last? In fact, when the previous guest just talked about radios, I mean, there are Quebec radio stations directly dedicated to this notion of right-wing extremism. We worry about Rush Limbaugh and that mentality in the States. We certainly have it here in Canada. And it's also that idea of whiteness has to be a conversation, and it seems to be a very reluctant conversation. I think it's interesting that after the shooting at the mosque, when the Prime Minister called it terrorism, there hasn't been more conversation on domestic terrorism, which in North America is absolutely equal to or is white terrorism. We don't have honest conversations about race and about understanding otherness and diversity. We like to pretend that we do. I would challenge most of the watchers and most of the people on TV stations and newspapers everywhere to even name the most prevalent imam in each city. This is not a conversation that we're having. We are not aware in a healthy, reasonable, respectful way about Muslims in this case until something like this happens.
And Safwan, I want to get your take as well. One of the things that Denis Coderre, the mayor of Montreal, said was that some Muslims in Quebec feel like second-class citizens. Your read on that?
Well, and you know, I would just take it right back exactly what was just said earlier when we're talking about there's extremists on both ends. There's no doubt the fact that we are fighting a war against violent extremists being exported into Canada or the United States and elsewhere. But there's also this homegrown extremist, which is, as you just mentioned, the white nationalists, the right wing. And the underlying objective of both these groups is very identical. It's to divide society. They have their own self-motives. They have their own political gains that they're looking for. You know, what is often troublesome is whenever a terror attack takes place and it's attributed to the faith of Islam. As you can imagine, it's heartbreaking, it's gut-wrenching when the faith that you prescribe to for your peace, for your harmony, for your love and compassion for others is immediately pointed to and targeted when an attack takes place. But whenever a right-wing extremist attack takes place, it's just narrowed down to an individual, and we're not tackling the mindset leading into it. So naturally, as I mentioned earlier, there may be a conflict of classes, but how we evaluate that is what can we do? How can we assess that? Recently, we launched an initiative called Visit a Mosque, Matter of fact, just this Friday, tomorrow, we have hundreds of Canadians who have actually reached out to us that want to visit one of our mosques, whether it's in Calgary or Edmonton, here in Toronto or Ottawa. And we encourage people to do that. Come meet your fellow Muslims, ask them the questions. And that's how we elevate each other. I think that's how we eliminate the classes of citizenship or defining people based on their views, but rather the common thread that we have, which is the Canadian mosaic. Obviously, this attack, more specifically in Quebec City, is not the first attack on Muslims. I mean, these attacks have been taking place against Muslims since the time of the founding of the faith. Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, his dear friends were attacked and lost their lives, his house, his property, and right down to his spouse. But where we find our solace is how he responded with love and compassion and kindness, and that's what he taught his followers. And that's what we know, and that's what I know as a Muslim. And this is the narrative that we want people to understand, so they also understand what truly our faith stands for.
Safwan, Amira, Shirley, thank you for coming on today. Great to talk to you. Great conversation.